Hi and welcome to Flip Teaching, and in this session we're going to be looking at learning theories. So there are three main learning theories that we need to look at, and they're called operant conditioning, there's the cognitive learning theory, and there's also social learning theory as well. So we need to be able to describe and then evaluate each one of these. So let's get started. Operant conditioning. Well, what is this? First and foremost, it's in that word conditioning. It's about creating connections between two things and then conditioning a potential response. Now, Skinner in '64 did a lot of work on this, and he used a box with a rat inside. And if the rat hit the lever inside the box, a food pellet would be released. So through trial and error, the rat eventually learned that hitting the lever would produce food. So this became known as the operant conditioning, or trial and error learning. Okay, so we do this a lot as well. If you think about how you teach your dog to do certain things, sit or do tricks, we condition it. We're trying to get it to do a particular thing for us. And what this is known as is manipulating the environment. Okay, so if you think about it, if your dog sits for you, you give it a treat. Now, it's not going to get it right straight away, so what you have to do is reinforce the behavior that you want. So that's the next key characteristic of operant conditioning. Trial and error, but then reinforcement. Now, this is quite an important aspect of all learning, and what we'll do is just give this a little bit of attention. So here you can either give positive or negative reinforcement. So you can give negative reinforcement for the behavior that you don't want and positive for the behavior that you do. That way you're reinforcing the situation. You're trying to manipulate the environment, and in essence what you're trying to do is modify something's behavior. So for example, the dog, making sure that the dog sits when you want it to. You're eventually getting the behavior that you want, and therefore you potentially would give positive reinforcement. So what about sports? So if you think about your coach, how does your coach use this operant conditioning? Alright, so let's say for example they show you how to do something, you copy it, and if you get it right, then you would get praise. So a coach gives you instructions about a set move or a set piece. They may give you praise about how you've done that. Okay, so let's have a look at this in a live situation then. So a coach here has set up a drill where they're repeating the activity. So they're going through the process of a mass practice. The environment has been manipulated, so they've set up pads, and obviously they're just doing some kind of contact exercise. Then what's going to happen is the coach is going to stop it, give some kind of feedback, and then go back into the drill, the activity. And he would have given positive or negative feedback so that he's reinforcing the behavior he wants, and therefore manipulating the outcome, manipulating the behavior until it's the desired one. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so just to finish off this section then, we'll just look at how we use praise and what's it for. So let's say the stimulus is the net shot, it's trying to score in the basket. What we're trying to do is reinforce the right technique for the player. And this is known as, and quite importantly, the stimulus response bond. It's the bond between the right technique for that right moment. And the way that we reinforce this is through praise or certification. And that's what praise is principally used for. Alright, so let's move on to cognitive learning then. So this has also got another name, and it's called Gestaltist, which in essence means the whole thing. So what we're doing there is taking into account the environment. We're thinking about all different situations, and we're giving the player the opportunity to explore those in different types of practices. So the best way to do that is have a look at this in a live practice video setting. Okay, so you can see in this situation here that the whole skill has been presented. In other words, it's a practice where the players have got to work things out for themselves. So there's no breaking it down, there's no connections between the stimulus and response. What they've done is that they've been given a problem, which is obviously one team versus another, and then they have to work out what the best options are, what skills to perform in particular situations. And this Gestaltist or cognitive approach is one that allows you to develop your understanding of a situation, and is also the highest form of learning, and it needs reasoning and intelligence as well. So one of the issues about this is that you've got to have a perception of what you're supposed to do. If you've got no skills, then you're not going to be able to perform this level of understanding. You're not going to be able to achieve the skills. So to start with, you would argue that you would use the operant conditioning, and then once they've got the skill set, as you can see some of the players have here, that they can start to use their perception as to whether they're going to use those particular skills in that situation or not. Alright, so a really effective way of learning, but perception is absolutely essential, and skill level as well. Okay, so let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of that. So it's best for a whole skill or an open skill. It's dependent on previous experience and also on perception. So it does allow for flow of the skill, so you really get a kinesthesis of what it's supposed to feel like, and that's absolutely essential, but it does need previous experience. And so the last section that we're going to look at here is the social learning or observational learning. So this is not just where we copy somebody's behaviour, but we're also mirroring social norms and moral judgments as well. But principally it's about modelling behaviour, in other words mirroring behaviour. We do this a lot. Now some of that behaviour that we mirror may not be that desirable. For example, kids smoking as one example, but we in essence mirror our parents, and we're more likely to mirror the parent who is of the same gender as us, and we have a role as a coach in this as well. So what we do is we become a significant other. Now there are certain components that if we put in place, they're more likely to mirror our behaviour. So they'll copy us if we're relatively similar. So again, we could say about gender, but also if we give off a consistent message or consistent moral judgment, then that's more likely to get modelled behaviour. And also if it's within the parameters of social norms, again that will increase the potential for the clients to model our behaviour. So how does this process work? Let's have a look at this. So there are four main sections, relatively straightforward. So the first one is paying attention to the relevant cues. What are the teaching points that the coach is trying to give you? Pay attention to those, and that's the first element. But we must be able to remember or retain what they've actually told us. That way we can focus on those particular cues at the relevant point prior to a race. Again, we must have motivation. If we don't have motivation to perform this skill, to remember them, then practice them, nothing's going to happen. And lastly is the motor skill. We need to have the motor skill. There's no point the coach throwing you in the water, telling you to swim if you can't actually do it. So what we say then is that we have attention, retention, motivation, and the motor program. So we are armed, ARMM. So the teacher's giving us the teaching points, we pay attention to those, we're retaining that information and then recalling it at the relevant point. We have the motivation and drive to learn the particular skill, and we also have the motor programs to achieve it as well. Now let's look at some knowledge checkers to make sure we clearly understand what we need to do. So in here, describe the theories of operant conditioning when applied to the learning of a motor skill, 6 marks. So the first thing that we need to be able to do is describe, and that's the command word. It's not asking us to analyze, evaluate, but simply describe. Absolutely essential that we read the question clearly and we identify the command word. But we must also look at the learning of the motor skills, so it's got to be linked to motor skills. So pause the screencast, make sure you go through this at your own pace. But principally you can see that it describes what operant conditioning is first and foremost, and then it goes through each one of the elements that we've looked at in the previous sections of the screencast. It mentions the SR bond and how we were going to reinforce that. Okay, so the next one then, do exactly the same with this. Identify what the command word is. It's obviously about the cognitive theory of learning, but we must describe it. It says give a practical example, fine, so we can add that into our answer, but it must be about the movement skill. So in this one here, you can see straight away, number 1, problem solving, learning by solving problems. The third one down is gestaltist, which means the whole problem given as one. Number 4 is that insight, understanding, learning or understanding, and intuitive learning. And lower down you can see that number 7 is it's linked to past experiences to form a response using your experiences. So all of the components that we've previously looked at in the screencast. Okay, thanks for flipping your learning, and thanks for using Flip Teaching.